So my name is Rasmus Landersø, and I'm a senior researcher at the Rockwell Foundation Research Unit in Copenhagen in Denmark. So my main area of research is the determinants of equality of opportunity, social mobility, and equality more generally. So I think that the determinants of different life trajectories are one of the most central aspects of social sciences, not only from an academic perspective, but also from a policy perspective. Because if we don't understand the roots of inequality, it's hard to address them by policies. So the lens through which I view much of my research and much of the research questions that I pose and study is via the Scandinavian welfare state. So I live in Denmark. And I'm really interested in what the different policies in the welfare state, what they do, and in particular also what they don't do. So being from Denmark, that really affects much of my research. And what I've learned from my research is that, well, the Scandinavian countries are praised for many of the aspects in terms of the welfare state, so universal access to education, to healthcare, levels of social mobility, etc. And that's true in many aspects, but there's still substantial inequality in other aspects. That could, for instance, be education or health. And these inequalities are actually in the same order of magnitude as we see in other countries with completely different types of welfare states, completely different policy regimes, such as the UK or the United States. And this of course raises questions about what the underlying mechanisms about inequality, what they are. So if we see that whether you go to college and complete college or whether you drop out of high school is still highly dependent on your background, even when education is free, even when expenses to public schools are very homogeneous across different catchment areas. Well, that raises a question about then what is basically the root of inequality in educational attainment. And you can think of similar things about inequality in health. The nexus that I find extremely fascinating is that in my research, the aspects where I continue to see inequality in Denmark are really the aspects where you have that is solely driven by behavior. So take for instance income. Income can be redistributed by income transfers, taxes. And in Denmark or Scandinavian countries in general, we see that income inequality is low and income mobility is high. But if you take another thing, like education or human capital, you can't redistribute human capital. That can only be learned or acquired. And it's acquired throughout childhood. And that is an aspect where we do see inequality. And the same with health. You can't redistribute health. That's dependent on your behavior. Of course, also dependent on your background, depending on your parents, for instance, genetics. And you can't redistribute that. And we still see inequality there. Another area that I study is the unintended consequences of different aspects of the welfare states. So one example could be the unintended consequences of high social transfers in terms of educational incentives. So high levels of social transfers, that of course reduces income inequality, and that might be desirable, but it also reduces the incentives to acquire an education because the returns into education are reduced. And what we see is actually that, at least for low-skilled individuals, that actually reduces educational attainment due to the high level of transfers. Another unintended consequence connected to transfer payments, for instance, would be the incentives to obtain employment. So actually going at the extensive margin from having no job to having a job. So if you take, for instance, social assistance in Denmark, that is one of the world's most generous transfers, but it's means tested, and it's means tested at the household level. So that implies that if me and my wife receive social assistance, we will have to basically pay any earnings we get back dollar by dollar until our social assistance is exhausted. And that applies even with my wife as receives social assistance and I get a job. We will still be means tested on a household level. So that implies that the implied marginal tax rate here is 100% actually. And it is for a very substantial amount because the transfers are so large. And this is of course extremely important if you think of the employment incentives for low-skilled individuals who would receive a relatively low hourly wage. And in recent years, with the refugee migrations that we have to Europe, this is, an extremely acute problem because then there is a large inflow of low-skilled individuals with then very, very low incentives to obtain employment. And then on top of that, there are structural barriers in terms of language, etc. So they may not in themselves be able to obtain a very high hourly wage. So this is really an acute problem in Denmark as in many other European countries. So I think that it's well recognized that childhood, so the early years in our life, are extremely formative for later life. And this has been established not only within economics, but a large and active literature across disciplines, so sociology, psychology, etc. So I think actually that we have a quite good view of the potential mechanisms that may affect children and may affect later life. What I don't think we have is a good overview of the weights that we should assign to these different mechanisms. So which are important, which are the pivotal ones, and which are only second order effects. Also recently there has become increasing awareness of what you could call the power of place, so where you grew up matter. But what the role of the power of place is, we still don't really know. And also, is the power of place different between different units of measurement? So is what makes a neighborhood important the same as what makes a region or commuting zone important, the same as what makes a country important? We still don't know. So of course I've been influenced by the neighborhood that I grew up in. So the institutions, the schools, the peers, my friends throughout childhood. I've also been influenced by the country I grew up in. But are these influences the same? I've also been influenced by my parents, of course. But are these influences the same? And are they the same as the influences I got from my friends throughout childhood? Also, what made my parents choose that neighborhood in the first place? So the sorting of it. And does this interact with the type of parents they were? The type of inputs I got from the parents? The type of neighborhood they chose to live in? Again, these are open questions and I don't have the answers to them, but I hope to get closer to that in research in the future, because it's pivotal to know this if we are to address inequality from policy perspectives also. And this applies not only to education or income, but also to aspects like health or crime. And what I've also learned in my research is that if you look at, for instance, a crime, there are substantial behavioral spillovers that affects criminal behavior within a peer group. So that implies that whether an individual, whether an at-risk youth ends up committing crime is not only dependent on his or her childhood in itself, so the experiences and the inputs they got from parents or from siblings, but also from the peers, from the neighborhood basically. And again, that's pivotal knowledge if we are to address inequality, also criminal behavior, problems with crime rates more generally. So one thing I'm deeply fascinated about is actually history, and in particular how it has shaped countries and shaped institutions today. Because many of the institutions, many of the problems that we have today are actually originating from much, much earlier events. And also many of the things that we then can do today with policies depend on historical events earlier on. So one example could be in the Scandinavian countries, that there's very, very low levels of corruption. So the high trust in public institutions basically. But this predates the welfare states in Scandinavian countries by more than a century basically. Why is that? So this is of course a foundation for having the welfare states, of having high taxation levels, that you know that the taxes you pay are not spent by corrupt politicians, or they're not spent by corrupt public servants. But if this evolution started much, much, much earlier than the high taxation level that we see today, how can that be? And do they interact to some extent? And another aspect is, say, national identity or ethics. I mean, you can raise the same questions about that. So I think that is extremely fascinating. But it's also important actually to know in order to actually be able to address the policy issues that we see today.